Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, our sponsor, Wondrium, the former Great Courses teaching company, of which I've been a fan for decades, now has a subscription service. So instead of buying or renting courses where you're stuck with a course, and if you don't like some or all the lectures, you have it. Well, now you can subscribe and you can just bounce around and try different courses, different lectures, and so on. Just for fun, I typed in the search browse window, philosophy and religion. Here's a few of their offerings. The Triumph of Christianity. Oh, that's Bart Ehrman. I read his book on that, and now I'm going to take that course. Think Like a Stoic, Masters of Greek Thought, Lives of Great Christians, Great Ideas of Philosophy. I took that course already. Luther, Gospel, Law, and Reformation, The Beginnings of Judaism, and so forth. So let's just tap on one of them, like Great Ideas of Philosophy, since I took that course. And that access is, oh my gosh, I forgot how long this course was. Whoa, this is awesome. 60 lectures, 30 minutes each. Oh my gosh, this is great. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but, this 60, 30-minute lecture, it took about 30 hours. So this would take even me a couple of weeks, and I consume a lot of this content. But if you listen to it at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, you can get through each lecture at about 20 minutes. So you could do 3 a day easily. And anyway, you get the idea. But some of them I don't care about, like Hippocrates and the Science of Life. Well, maybe I do care about that one. Aristotle on friendship. Maybe I don't care about that one. So I just skip to the next one on the list. Aristotle and the Perfect Life. Rome, the Stoics and the Rule of Law. Islam, Hobbes and the Social Machine. What is Enlightenment? Kant on Freedom. And on and on and on. Fabulous. So here's the deal. You get a free 1-month trial through the show here at wondrium.com/Shermer. So wondrium.com/Shermer. And that gives you a 1-month free trial. Why would you not do this? It's free. All right. You just log on and you're in. And then you can listen to as many lectures as you want. And at the end of the month, you just subscribe, because why would you not? And if you don't want to, of course you don't have to. All right, that's our sponsor of the show, and thank you. By the way, thank you for your support of the show in general, and thank you for listening. Here's our next guest. My guest today is Matt Ridley, co-author of the new book Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, a rather timely subject. His co-author is Alina Chan, who is a postdoctoral researcher with a background in medical genetics, synthetic biology, and vector engineering. He's at the Broad Institute of MIT and at Harvard, and is currently creating the next generation vectors for human gene therapy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Chan began to investigate problems relevant to finding the origins of SARS-CoV-2 virus, and in parallel spearheaded the development of the COVID-19 COVID genetics browser for scientists worldwide to rapidly track virus lineages and mutations by locations and date ranges of interest. Alina's not doing much media, so she's not on the show here. She has actually been highly criticized for even suggesting that it's possible there was a lab leak. The lab leak hypothesis is not discussable in most of these medical circles, and she's trying to launch her own a young career here. Matt Ridley is the author of books that have sold well over 1 million copies in 32 languages. Matt's been on the show before. He's a longtime friend, including The Red Queen, The Origins of Virtue, Genome, Nature via Nurture, Francis Crick, The Rational Optimist, The Evolution of Everything, and How Innovation Works. In his bestseller Genome and in his biography of Francis Crick, he showed an ability to translate the details of genomic discoveries into understandable and exciting stories. During the current pandemic, he has written essays for the Wall Street Journal and The Spectator about the origin and genomics of the virus. His most recent Wall Street Journal piece appeared on January 16, 2021, and he's a member of the House of Lords in the UK. So Matt and I get into the details of, what exactly is a virus? How does it work? How does it evolve? Why are some species or strains more deadly than others? And how evolution selects for those sorts of things? And the difference between how you acquire the virus and how it kills people and spreads through populations. And then we get into the details of the two different hypotheses on the table. That is the spillover from animals to humans in nature, or these wet markets, versus the lab leak hypothesis, that it was in part a gain of function research that then escaped the lab and spread through populations. These are not two independent hypotheses. They both could harbor some elements and interactive features together. So, and Matt is very careful not to be politicized at all. He just wants to know. We all want to know, really. We should all want to know, what is the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the fact is, at this point, on December 1st, 2021, we don't know. No animals have been found with the exact same genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 virus in them. And yet there's not a super smoking gun that it is a lab leak from a gain of function research. We just don't know. And so you can read the book yourself and get all the details and weigh the evidence. Hopefully more evidence will be forthcoming. This is another point that we discuss at length. The secrecy involving this, particularly out of China, and how difficult it's been to get even Western scientists even interested in discussing the subject of a possible lab leak. So that then leads us into discussing how science works and sociology and philosophy of science, and why Matt and I both agree that citizen scientists should and have, in this case, played a role. And wow. Well, okay, we'll see how that unfolds. Anyway, it's a fascinating conversation. Matt is one of the clearest thinkers and explainers of complex subjects like this. So hope you enjoy the conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast, please do support us through the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So your donations are tax deductible. Just go to skeptic.com/donate and you can give us some support that way. All right. Thanks for listening. Matt Ridley, nice to see you again. Thanks for coming back on the show. This may be your most important book, given what we're living through at the moment.
Correct. Michael, it's great to be back with you.
How's the reception of the book been so far?
Sorry, I interrupted you there. The reception of the book has been mixed. It's getting rave reviews from readers, particularly Amazon and places. The reviews are very positive and very, very interesting. But a lot of the book formal reviews in newspapers have been very negative, but they haven't really reviewed the book. They've reviewed the fact that we wrote it and said that we shouldn't have done.
Why?
Well, I think there's a lot of people went out on a limb saying that the lab leak theory was a conspiracy theory and a nutcase. A crackpot theory. And they have associated it with a lot of genuine conspiracy theories, that Bill Gates caused the pandemic, or that 5G caused the pandemic, or something like that. And so they are finding it very hard to admit that possibility needs to be taken seriously. And they're accusing us of, one of the reviews accused us of pimping the lab leak theory, which I thought was a pretty offensive word to use about a serious book.
Yeah.
But we don't do that. We have a chapter towards the end of the book in which we give the strongest possible case we can, after showing lots of evidence throughout the book, that this came about as a result of a natural spillover in a market. And then we have another chapter saying, but here's another possibility that it came out of a lab. So just by being balanced, we seem to have offended a lot of people. And I find that hard to understand.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that assessment. And they're wrong, because a conspiracy theory, by definition, is two or more people plotting in secret to do something to a third party to gain an illegal or immoral advantage. This is how I define it in my next big book on conspiracies. And people get confused about this because there's conspiracies and there's conspiracy theories. The theories may be true or false. The theory that Watergate happened, that turned out to be a true conspiracy. And Iran-Contra and the WikiLeaks, the Afghanistan papers, the Pentagon papers, these are all conspiracy theories that turn out to be true conspiracies, right? So, but what you're talking about, lab leak, you're not saying the Chinese government plotted and conspired to create this bioweapon and then unleash it on the Western world. That's not what no one's arguing that. So it's not even a conspiracy theory. It's just an accident.
One or two people do argue that, but not very convincingly. And we think it doesn't deserve to be taken seriously at all, that possibility that this is a deliberate bioweapon. It makes no sense. There's no evidence for it, and so on. And yet that possibility got conflated in the public mind quite deliberately in some way with the possibility that there was an accident while doing well-meant research, well-meaning research on viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology or one of its partners in Wuhan. And by definition, an accident isn't a conspiracy, if you see what I mean. And one really important thing to bear in mind is that if you look at the leaks of SARS, when SARS infected people in laboratories, and we know of this happening at least 4 times, twice in Beijing, once in Taiwan, once in Singapore, when laboratory workers got infected with SARS. 3 of those 4 occasions, they don't know how it happened. They didn't drop a test tube, they didn't break a flask, they didn't puncture a glove. They were working in what they thought were safe conditions, and yet someone got infected. They were working on SARS in a SARS lab, and they got SARS, so it's pretty obvious where they got it, because at that time there was no SARS in the community, so there was no other way of getting it. So this could have happened in this case. If someone was working with SARS-CoV-2 in a lab in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it's a much more infectious virus than SARS, and it generally has milder symptoms, particularly in younger people. So you wouldn't necessarily know that you'd picked it up. So it's easily possible that you can go through the records of these labs and find no evidence of an accident, and yet it's still, if it was being worked on in that lab, then there's a really good chance that someone would have picked it up.
Yeah, you have this nice diagram in the book kind of outlining the different possibilities. At the top, you have these bats with the viruses, and then so the natural spillover scenarios are it goes into an animal, which presumably is consumed at one of these markets, or cave guano miner or a local villager picks it up, and both of those go into the population, or the lab leak, lab-related spillover scenario, scientists collecting pathogen samples from animals or people, that goes into the population, or accident during laboratory research. So it's not, strictly speaking, just 2 different hypotheses that are unrelated. They can be very much interactive.
That's right. And so the possibility that this was picked up in the field rather than in the laboratory does have to be taken seriously, because there was an enormous amount of sampling of bats for viruses in southern China going on, mostly from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This was the leading lab looking into the origin of SARS for about a decade and a half, since the mid 2000s. And they caught and sampled thousands of bats, mostly in southwestern China, because they quickly zeroed in on that being the area where these viruses were to be found. And they wore protective equipment for some of these sampling expeditions, but not for all. They actually show videos of themselves in caves handling bats without goggles on, without a mask on. It was very hot. It was very uncomfortable doing that. Sometimes they took them off. David Quammen, in his rather nice book Spillover, actually went into a cave with some of these researchers looking for, not in China, but in a Southeast Asian country. No, I think it was in southern China. Anyway, and they're looking for bats. And he says to them, "Excuse me, if we're looking for SARS viruses, how come we're not wearing protective equipment?" And the reply comes, "Well, I guess it's like driving without a seatbelt." So the possibility of a researcher getting infected in the field is quite high. Now, would that researcher have had a connection with Wuhan? Yes, because the Wuhan Institute of Virology is where most of these researchers were based and where they took their samples back to.
Yeah, I loved your book. I listened to it on audio. It was like I tweeted about this. It's like listening to Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain. It's this kind of gripping story.
That is high praise.
It is. It's an incredible story. And the thing is, it's not a history book. It's still unfolding. And as we're recording this, the Omicron variant is sweeping around the world. It'll probably be 100% everywhere within a week or 2. It's just phenomenal. And so who knows how this is going to play out. But, you and I are both interested in the history and philosophy of science and how science works. And it's interesting that the lab leak hypothesis was completely legitimate. People were talking about it in the early sort of winter of 2020. And then there was that Nature paper that analyzed the genome and said, well, there's no evidence of manipulation. gain of function. So that hypothesis is refuted. Then it became a crazy conspiracy theory to even bring it up. And that takes us all the way to a couple months ago when Jon Stewart, over the summer, was on Stephen Colbert's show, and he had that great moment. It's gone viral where he says, the disease is the same name as the lab. It's the Institute of Virology right there. And then he has this funny little riff where he says, "There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Oh, I don't know. Maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean, or it's the chocolate factory." So you ask in your book, what are the chances that the SARS-CoV-2 virus happened naturally in the wild near one of the world's leading centers for research on SARS? And then you quote Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, "Of all the gin joints and all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine."
Yeah, and you see a lot of people, and in fact, I think in that clip, Jon Stewart is responded to by whoever his host was, I can't remember on that day, who said, but Stephen Colbert, I guess, he says, but surely they built the lab there because the viruses are there. And a lot of people think that. A lot of people think, Wuhan must have been the epicenter for this kind of virus. That's why they built it there. That's not the case. I mean, Wuhan is quite a long way north. It's in central China. It's on the Yangtze River. And there's a thing called the Wuhan Center for Disease Control, which did a lot of sampling of bats in the Wuhan area throughout Hubei province. About 10,000 bats were sampled by one guy and his team. And they never found these viruses there. These viruses are found 1,000 miles to the south. I mean, it's like saying, come on, of course you'd find that in New York, because New York's in the same country as Miami. It's that sort of distance we're talking about.
Yeah, but my point is that then it became acceptable. Not only acceptable, then Biden says, "Hey, we better look into this." So you have this kind of cultural shift where it's not only acceptable, but of course we should look into this. And then it's politicized. So had Trump said that, if he was still president, he said it, it would be, "Oh, that's a crazy Trump, anti-China kind of statement to make." Whereas when Biden says it, it's like, yeah, we better look into this hypothesis. So that's kind of a sociology of right. Knowledge and science.
Yeah, people say, the reason people don't want to take this seriously is because Trump was the first to raise it. But actually, I think that underplays the degree to which this is a bipartisan thing. As you say, the Biden administration comes in January 21 and quite quickly says we're going to continue to take this possibility seriously. They don't actually sort of use the same phrases and so on, but they basically... Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, comes up with a pretty strong statement when the World Health Organization reports saying, this isn't good enough. We think we need to take this hypothesis seriously. And they set the intelligence community off onto it. So it's not the case that this has fallen into the American two-party system and got bipolarized there. But there is a serious polarization that's gone on between what most intelligent people think. I run into people all the time who say, well, come on, I've read enough to know that it's easily possible it came out of a laboratory, between what they think and what the mainstream media and the mainstream scientific establishment says, which is we can rule out this possibility.
Right. Yes. Let's kind of look at a bigger picture for a moment, just since you have written about genomes and small things before. Sort of walk us through the difference between a virus and a bacteria, their size, function, difference. Virus, is it actually even alive? How do you define that? Kind of give us the bigger picture there.
Yeah, well, I use a very, very rough analogy. It's not quite right in terms of scale, but it gives you an idea, which is that if the protozoan that causes malaria were a dog, then the a bacterium would be a mouse, and a virus would be a flea. And that's the sort of difference we're talking about. Viruses are far, far smaller than bacteria. They infect bacteria. They are just a package of genes inside a protein shell. They're bad news wrapped in protein, as somebody said famously. And there's gazillions of viruses in the world. Some of them are relatively harmless. Most of them are very specific. They only infect one species or one group of species. And so they get very specialized at prizing open the cells. They spread by means of coughing and sneezing in a lot of cases. Most of the viruses we catch these days are spread by coughing and sneezing. They're respiratory viruses. But of course, there are insect-borne viruses like Zika and dengue and yellow fever, and there are waterborne and sexually transmitted viruses as well, like HIV. So there's tons of viruses, and they have tons of ways of infecting people. And they are because the key about a virus is that it doesn't have its own biochemistry. It doesn't have its own machinery. It borrows yours, or it borrows a bacterium's, or whoever it infects. So it comes in and it gives instructions to your cell to make more copies of itself. That's all it does. And that makes it very hard to attack with pharmaceuticals, because it doesn't have any biochemistry to attack. It's using your own biochemistry. And that's why it's so tough to design antivirals, whereas antimicrobials, antibiotics, have been very successful on the whole.
Yeah. Remember years ago, I had a viral infection and had some blood drawn. And then the lab technician, or then the doctor, comes in and gives me the figure of like how many viruses are in my, what I thought was my body. And it was some phenomenal number, like 200,000 or something. I thought, there's 200,000 of these viruses in my body? They go, no, in that drop of blood. Like, what? I mean, I just felt so.
That's like the scale. The scale is very hard to get your mind around. I mean, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of SARS-CoV-2 viruses circulating in the world now, yet they'd all fit in. I mean, in 2020, someone said they'd all fit in a Coke can. I'm sure that's not quite true now, but you get the point.
Yeah. So how does it kill people?
SARS-CoV-2 seems to kill people mainly by robbing them of the ability to breathe. It's oxygen deprivation becomes a big part of it, but it also affects the heart, the blood vessels. It causes blood clots, thromboses, things like that. And in general, fighting a virus, you're having lots of your cells rupture and burst and die in your system, and your body's going around cleaning up the mess, trying to repair tissues, etc. And there comes a point where it fails to, the damage is too much and it can't repair it. So, but that's not what most viruses do. I mean, it's very interesting that colds. There's 200 kinds of virus cause the common cold. Some of them are rhinoviruses, some of them are adenoviruses, some of them are coronaviruses. But they tend to infect the cool mucosal surfaces of your nose and throat because they like to be cool. They don't have very stable genomes, and they don't really want to get inside your body, because inside your body there's going to be antibodies, and T cells are going to come down on them like a ton of bricks and wipe them out. So by staying on these external surfaces but exploiting the cells from the outside, they can replicate in huge numbers and then spread very effectively by making you sneeze and cough. And that seems to be a very successful strategy for viruses in human beings, especially because we live in such dense societies and we spend so much time bumping into strangers. So, a virus that doesn't incapacitate its victim, so he still goes out to parties and meetings, but coughs and sneezes, that virus is going to do really well. And the same, interestingly, applies to bats. Because, unlike, say, tigers or pangolins, bats are highly gregarious creatures. They live in these incredibly dense roosts. I mean, I make the point in the book that there's a bat cave in Texas where 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats live. That's roughly the size of Mexico City, So it's the same idea. There's no other mammals live in these incredibly vast, dense aggregations. And so it's no accident that bats harbor a lot of respiratory viruses too, and an awful lot of our recent novel infections have come from bats. SARS, Nipah, MERS, Hendra, Ebola. These are all bat diseases that we've started to catch in human beings.
How come it doesn't kill the bats?
Well, it does sometimes, no doubt. But a lot of bats will have come to an accommodation with these viruses. They'll have an immune system that knows how to control them, and by evolution. And the viruses may have come to an accommodation with the bats, whereby they've worked out a way of efficiently replicating, but without necessarily killing the bat, which might be a dead end for them. There's a interestingly, bats have an immune system. Bats' temperature varies enormously. They go from pretty cool when they're roosting or hibernating to extremely hot when they're flying around. Their heartbeat is extraordinarily high, and the body temperature goes way up. And this puts huge pressure on their cells and on their genes and all this kind of thing. And it tends, when you're very, very hot and running the engine very hard, you do a lot of damage to your cells. You get bits of DNA floating around. The response to that, cleaning up the mess, is what we call inflammation. The body sending white blood cells to clear up the mess and that kind of thing. So bats actually have suppressed their inflammatory systems. And a lot of the response to this virus in human beings, which does a lot of the damage, is inflammation, is our own response to the virus rather than the virus itself. The bat immune system is pretty distinct, is pretty different, has unique characteristics, and that might have led to viruses evolving in bats that, when they get in human beings, kind of go berserk because we don't have a mechanism of controlling them. But I don't want to exaggerate how berserk this virus goes, because, for most people, this doesn't kill them. This is a relatively mild virus compared with MERS and SARS, which have very high death rates. This one has a death rate that's, well, it's now down with vaccines. It's well down into the 0.1%, 0.2% of people die. But it tends to kill. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sorry. Yes, exactly. 0.1%.
So at some point, just to kind of put this in perspective, HIV was at 100% fatality rate until the drug cocktails were developed.
That's right, but over a long period of time. And what HIV does, which is classic for a sexually transmitted disease, is that it goes into hiding and does no harm for a long time, and then it comes out later. Now, if you're sexually transmitted, you don't want to be, rushing out there and making your host infectious right away. You want to go into hiding, and then every 6 months, every year or two, come out and look around, see if he's got a new partner. Because that way you're going to infect a new partner. So, herpes, gonorrhea, syphilis, they all have this tendency to persist for a very long time, but erupt occasionally. And HIV is in that sense a classic sexually transmitted disease, but one with, as you say, a terrifying death rate before the invention of protease inhibitor drugs.
Right. So from an evolutionary perspective, if you're a virus, ideally you don't want to be too deadly too quickly. So then why does
if you're a respiratory virus, it's very important to talk in terms of how you get spread. If you're spread by insects, you probably do want to be deadly. You want the guy lying in a delirious state, sweating in a darkened room, so that the insects can find him, and so that he's not feeling well enough to swat them away. So actually, that's why the insect-borne diseases often do tend to be pretty lethal, much more so than the respiratory viruses.
Right. And Ebola, how does that kill?
Well, Ebola is too lethal for its own good, probably, i.e. it really struggles to get an epidemic going. In West Africa in 2014, it jolly nearly did get a big epidemic going. It spreads by, infecting the whole body, and then people basically, I think, vomit blood and sneeze blood on other people, and that infects them. So it's a very nasty disease indeed, with a very high death rate. But it's by treating dying patients that most people get infected. So again, it's the attendants who catch it and things like that. So it's a bit more like an insect-borne disease in that case. It's by getting really ill that you get people to come and handle you.
I guess what I'm getting at is it possible that COVID-19 could just keep mutating and evolving, and at some point it'll just be like the seasonal flu, maybe slightly worse, but not a pandemic that's going to destroy humanity, or we'll have to shut down the economy again.
I think that's a definite possibility. It's conventional wisdom among virologists at the moment to poo-poo that, to say viruses don't necessarily evolve to be milder. Well, nobody says all do. As I said, insect-borne diseases are very lethal. Measles and smallpox didn't evolve to become milder, but they're not spread by sneezing and coughing. They're on the whole diseases of the lymphatic system. They get into the body and then they erupt out of it and kill a lot of people that they spread from there. So it's crucial to look at how a virus spreads and then to think about how many of the viruses we catch by coughing and sneezing, i.e., colds and flus, are really lethal. Almost none. And the exceptions kind of stand out. So the 1918 flu pandemic is very interesting in this case because Paul Ewald made this point some years ago. He said, actually, that was quite a mild flu to start with. First 6 months of 1918, starting in Kansas when it was first diagnosed, that may not have been where it began. It probably began in Far East because most influenza do. They come out of birds on the whole. But it's relatively mild, and then it spreads through the armies on the Western Front in particular, and it's pretty bad, but it's not deadly serious. And sometime around the middle of August 1918, doctors working in field hospitals in the Western Front start saying, "Whoa, we're seeing really nasty cases, and they're dying on us. These are young men who just got flu and they're just dead 3 days later. What's going on?" And I think what Paul Ewald argues was happening there was that if you had a mild case of influenza, you're in the front line, you're told to go and sleep it off in a dugout, right? If you have a serious case, you're put on a stretcher. You infect the two stretcher bearers. The stretcher bearers take you to a field hospital. You infect a bunch of nurses. The nurses decide they can't cope with you. They put you on a train to Boulogne with about 500 other wounded people. You infect all of them. On the ship across to England to go to another hospital, you infect another bunch of people, and so on. The severe cases are spreading much faster than the mild cases. So that virus evolved to be very virulent. And then the war stops a couple of months later, and the virus calms down again. So I think that is an exception that proves the rule, a respiratory virus that actually became harder. Now that tells me a lesson about lockdown, because in the first lockdown, mild cases of COVID were told to stay at home. That means they couldn't spread, at least not very efficiently. Severe cases were sent to hospitals. And we all know what happened in hospitals. A lot of people caught COVID for the first time in hospitals. By the way, this kind of speculation about the evolution of the severity of viruses is I do mention it in the book. It's not something that we're particularly focused on in the book, I should hasten to add, but it's me talking rather than Alina. She may not agree with some of the things I've said, so I should be careful to make that point.
Yeah, so it does seem like the social isolation was a good idea, at least initially. I don't know about now. What about masks? What are your thoughts on masks?
Well, I've looked at the evidence. I've read lots of papers on masks, and there was a meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal the other day, the BMJ, which said that they're 53% effective, more effective. I mean, that's the difference between mask wearing and not mask wearing. But when you dug down, there were only about 3 or 4 studies that had a significant difference. And when you dug into them, most of them turned out to be very poorly controlled studies, which didn't really show anything of the kind. One of them was this famous Bangladesh study, which frankly pretty well shows the opposite if you interpret it in a certain way. So I'm not convinced that masks, that we can be sure masks help. I wear them. I think they probably help a bit. It can't do much harm. But the aerosols by which these things spread, not by large droplets, but in tiny aerosols that are effectively airborne, these are not, they're coming out the sides of masks. And there is a possibility. I mean, I went to a memorial service for a much-loved friend a couple of months ago, and the instructions were, please wear a mask, so I did. But I thought, well, hang on, is that false reassurance? Is that meaning that people are going to go out to social events that they wouldn't go to otherwise, and therefore masks might be having a deleterious effect? So I think I just actually I'm not that interested in the topic. I'm not against masks. I'm in favor of people wearing them if it reassures. It might be doing some good, but I think it's unlikely. I mean, against Omicron, which is very infectious, I suspect they'll make very little difference.
Yeah, and then we have to distinguish between just the regular cloth masks that most of us wear versus the medical masks, the N95s, that do appear to be more effective than just the cloth mask. And also, it seems like the
Correct.
studies often depend on self-report data. That is, you just ask people, do you wear your mask? Well, maybe they're accurate and honest, maybe they're not. A little bit like dietary studies
Right.
where you ask people to tell us what you've eaten, and well, you kind of depend on them being accurate and honest.
And there's a huge cause and effect thing here. People who wear masks tend to be more cautious in other respects as well. So that might be why they haven't caught the virus, if that's
Confounds.
what the study shows.
That's right.
Sorry.
There's confounding effects. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn to China. I wanted to read another passage here from your book. You have this picture of a masked palm civet, which I had never seen before. Cute little dog-like animals. You write, in the spring of 2003, it dawned on investigators that many of the early cases of SARS had been food handlers, particularly chefs and others who had prepared animals for food. In May, in the search for the zoonotic source, a team of scientists from Hong Kong visited a live animal market in Shenzhen, Guangdong, to collect animal samples from different stalls, spanning wild and domestic species originating from different parts of southern China. All the animals appeared healthy. The scientists took samples from the noses and anuses of 25 animals from 8 mostly wild species: beaver, ferret, badger, hare, muntjac deer, domestic cat, hog, badger, raccoon dog, and Himalayan palm civet. Of most relevance to the story of SARS is the palm civet, a tree-climbing, fruit-eating relative of cats. An expensive dish popular with wealthy people from Guangdong is known as dragon tiger phoenix soup. It is flavored with chrysanthemum petals, but contains the meat of both civets and snakes. From the 25 market animals, the single raccoon dog and hog badger tested positive, as did 4 of the 6 civets. SARS virus was isolated from 5 of the animals, and 2 virus isolates from the civets were completely sequenced to obtain their genomes. Okay, first of all, how do you get an anal or nasal swab from a wild animal while they're just sitting there alive? I presume they're not terribly cooperative about that sort of thing.
You hold them very, very firmly in one hand. And
Yeah,
I mean, in the case of bats, you
so.
get the anal swabs with basically a Q-tip. That's what you go up the fundament with. But yeah, I think this has become fairly standard procedure for finding viruses is both anal and nasal swabs, because you're going into 2 different sort of orifices with 2 different airways and 2 different sort of passages, and you've got a good chance of finding these viruses there. And the interesting thing was they were finding that the palm civets were infected in the markets and in the restaurants, but when they went back up the chain and went to the farms where people were farming these palm civets, because although these are wild animals in the sense they've not been domesticated, they're not wild in the sense that most are now bred on farms for the table. But when you went to those farms, they weren't infected in the farms, so they were getting affected somewhere along the way from the farms to the things. Now, we don't actually know whether they got infected by people or by bats, but what we do know is that the virus they picked up was the one they then passed on to people, and it was a very close relation of viruses that are naturally found in bats, where the wild animal with these SARS-like viruses in it is bats. It's not just bats, it's horseshoe bats. It's a very specific genus of bat. There's about 100 horseshoe bat species in the world. These are the ones that hold the SARS-like coronaviruses. Interestingly, there are no horseshoe bats in the Americas. So this is an old world disease in an old world genus of animals.
Well, so if the traditional Chinese medicine market has as well as just their consumption, is linked to these diseases that are spreading through these wild animals and then bred on these farms. I'm surprised the Chinese government hasn't done something about this, considering how well they can control their population and how draconian they could be in enforcing laws. I mean, you make the point toward the end of the book that the wild trade market has still not been shut down, even though we know there's some connection there. What is your sense about
Well,
why
exactly.
why they still practice this?
Yeah, if they really thought this virus had come through the wildlife trade, they would be much more tough on the wildlife trade now than they have been. But it's just on the traditional Chinese medicine point. Um, this is something that Xi Jinping championed, uh, and he made specific speeches about how traditional Chinese medicine was an important part of Chinese culture, should be respected. At one point, there was a law being promulgated to make it a crime to criticize traditional Chinese medicine. And in 2019, the World Health Organization recognized traditional Chinese medicine as a legitimate form of medicine for the first time after Chinese requests to do so. So far from moving away from this form of medicine, it has actually been increasingly popular in recent years in China. Now, some traditional Chinese medicine, some of the acupuncture and other techniques are of interest to science and might work. But a lot of the dietary stuff, eating exotic animals to get better, um, you know, particularly grinding up the scales of pangolins. And pangolins can't be farmed on farms. They're anteaters. You can't feed them. They die if you try and keep them in captivity. So they're smuggled from all around the world, from Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, into China in large numbers. And the Chinese have been cracking down on that trade. But there are still practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine who are prescribing ground up pangolin scales as medication that can improve, fertility and all sorts of things. Now, the pangolin scale is made of the same substance as your fingernails are made of. So you might as well just bite your fingernails if that's what if you think that's what's doing you good. That really is quack medicine of a type that shouldn't be respected by governments. But in the wake of SARS, there was a brief crackdown on the use of exotic animals as food, particularly from wildlife. But then it got relaxed, and in particular, the farming of wild animals, of non-domesticated animals, like palm civets, like hog badgers, like bamboo rats, the farming of these species, like snakes, there were some big snake farms in China, for the market, took off as a seriously lucrative venture that a lot of people in rural China were encouraged to go into by official policies. So this is actually, and here comes an important point. The market for these things is in Guangdong province and one or two other places in Guangxi as well, in the far south of China. That is where the culture says you eat lots of exotic animals. In Wuhan, no, not nearly as common. And there was a wildlife trade into the markets of Wuhan. Fortunately, right up until just before the pandemic, there was work being done on this by wildlife trade specialists who were looking into the smuggling of wildlife and so on. But it was a pretty small one. The numbers of animals involved was pretty small. And it did not include pangolins, which were the species that were thought to have been carrying this virus, wrongly thought. It did not include bats. It did not include, as far as we can tell, any infected animals. 80,000 animals have been tested in China now for SARS-CoV-2, and none of them had it.
Yeah, that's a bit of evidence for a lab, not just a lab leak, but a genetic manipulation in a lab, because it didn't happen naturally, it appears. So when you have
Well,
percentage, when you have
that's
these
a slightly different question.
okay.
It's possible that this is an entirely natural virus that was being handled in a lab and escaped. It's also possible that it's an entirely natural virus from bats that was being manipulated in a laboratory.
Mm.
We discussed both those possibilities.
Yeah, so when you see figures like, this genome is 96% similar to SARS-CoV-2 genome and so forth, or 92%, I have no idea what that means. It sounds like a lot to me. It sounds close. I call this the Jack Benny effect. When Jack Benny was asked, "How's your wife?" he said, "Compared to what?" I got to have a comparison. I don't know if 96% is close or not close in terms of these
Well,
kinds of genomic comparisons.
there's a counter argument made that at least one reviewer of our book made, which is said, well, come on, chimpanzees are 96% the same as human beings at the genetic level. That doesn't make them the cause of the disease. I mean, sorry, that doesn't make them, particularly close. They're very different. Well,
Yeah.
hang on a minute. The generation time of a chimpanzee or a human being is 25 years. The generation time of a virus is, a couple of hours. So, so, um, so and the genome of a virus is 30,000 letters long. The genome of a human being is 3 billion letters long. So 96% the same of a small piece of text that is evolving very fast is not the same as 96% of something that's gigantic and evolving very slowly. It's not that big a difference, but it's not the same virus. When they found SARS in palm civets, we're talking 99% the same as the one that caused the pandemic. We haven't found a 99% the same one in an animal, in a bat, or in a animal sold in a market. So the closest we know of was this one found in a freezer in Wuhan, collected from a mine shaft in southern China called RATG13, which is 96.2%. And then just very recently, one collected in Laos in 2020, after the pandemic began, from a wild bat. Both of them were from wild bats, which is 96.8%. And the Laos one might make you think, so the one in the freezer is not so suspicious after all, because there are bats flitting around in Laos with 96% the same. Yeah, but 96% is not the virus. It's close, but it's not that close. And who's been collecting viruses in Laos over the last 5 or 6 years and sending them to Wuhan specifically? Scientists from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's spelled out in research grants that came to light very recently. That Western scientists were going to collect bats in Laos and were going to get them analyzed by sending them with scientists from the Wuhan Institute of Virology back to Wuhan to be analyzed there. So there's a connection, even between these Southeast Asian countries and Laos.
Yeah. We're back to Hershey, Pennsylvania for the origins of chocolate. Right. So give us a quick tweetorial. I hadn't heard that term until I read your book. That's really funny. I guess that would be a Twitter thread kind of outlining an argument for what a gain of function research is and what's the connection with Anthony Fauci approving some funding for gain of function research at the Wuhan lab and so on.
Yeah, well, it's a very controversial subject, this, and it gets very political very quickly, and I'm not here to pick a political fight. So I'll be careful what I say. But the concept of gain of function gained public credence in around 2014, when there were a couple of experiments that had been done in 2011 that led to a debate and then a moratorium on certain kinds of research. And the experiments were, let's see how easy it is to make an influenza virus that can infect birds capable of infecting mammals. Now, the reason we want to do this is we want to know how dangerous these bird flus are, how close they are to turning into ones that can infect human beings and cause a pandemic. So it's, we've got the best aims here. Our aim is to prevent the next pandemic. But what we're going to do in the process is we're going to evolve a virus from infecting birds into infecting mammals, in this case ferrets. And in doing so, yes, we're running a risk. We're training a virus on mammals. Now, you can argue that that might happen in the wild anyway, so it doesn't make any difference if we do it in a lab. But other scientists said, no, hang on. This is like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. You might end up causing the thing you're worried about. So that's where the phrase gain of function came from. And then there was this big debate with half of science saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this, and the other half saying, come on, this is exactly what we should be doing if we want to prevent the next pandemic. And in 2014, the Obama administration, after a couple of lab accidents, actually, by the way, those flu experiments were done very responsibly. They had all the right permissions. They were done very carefully, and they said, we're going to do these dangerous experiments. Is that okay? And everybody said yes. So it wasn't as if, there's some rogue scientists out there. But by 2014, the Obama administration had decided to put a moratorium on this kind of research, naming specific viruses that they were going to apply to. And coronaviruses were amongst those. And this brought to a halt some experiments that were going on, particularly in North Carolina, relating to coronaviruses. And it arguably meant that a bunch of the experiments being done in Wuhan in particular around that time, taking bat viruses and swapping their spike genes so that they became capable of infecting human cells in the laboratory more efficiently, were gain of function. Now, whether they fell within the exact definition of what was being hit by the moratorium or not, and whether the moratorium applied outside America, and whether it applied to experiments that had already begun, etc., this is all for the lawyers to decide. That I'm not that interested in it. But were experiments done in Wuhan to make coronaviruses more efficient at infecting human cells and human mice, and more efficient at killing humanized mice? When I said human mice, I meant humanized mice. These are mice with human genes in them. Yes, they were. So there is no doubt that experiments were done that increased the virulence and infectivity of viruses in human cells and humanized mice. Now that's, you can decide whether that comes under a legal definition of gain of function if you want, but it is gain of function in the sense of you have gained the function of infecting human cells more efficiently.
Yeah. I don't know how to ask this. Let's see, because I know you don't want to broach the subject, but there are bad actors. They're terrorist organizations. There are bad state actors, North Korea maybe, or Iran, something like that are not too friendly with us. Could some bad actors get a hold of this technology and say, hey, we can create a bioweapon in the same way that they want to create nuclear weapons?
I think I'm really quite concerned about this question, actually, because if you're a bad actor, whether it's North Korea or whether it's ISIS or someone like that, and you want to cause havoc in the Western world, you will have watched the last 2 years and thought, whoa, that did a lot more damage than a couple of bombs on an airplane or something like that. And you will have also said, and what's more, the World Health Organization breezed in and said, well, nothing to see here, probably came in on frozen food from overseas. So you won't even get the blame, but you've caused havoc in society. And so it is of huge concern to me. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's important that we find out how this thing happened. I suspect if you're a North Korean laboratory gaining the expertise to do these kind of experiments, to juice up a coronavirus so that it's capable of killing people and spreading efficiently, is probably beyond you unless you enter into a 10-year collaboration with brilliant scientists in North Carolina and, University of Utrecht in the Netherlands and these other places, which is kind of what the Wuhan scientists did. So I suspect they would fail to come up with a bioweapon. and it wouldn't be an effective military weapon. You couldn't give it to your enemies and have your friends not be killed by it, like in the James Bond films. That we're not in that position. It's theory. You could develop a vaccine for your own people in secret, but we're not talking about those kind of capabilities yet. So some comfort can be had from the fact that the capabilities probably aren't there in the bad actors, and they couldn't get there without huge amount of collaboration with other countries, which would kind of spoil the point, because you would then find out what was going on. But nonetheless, there is this century is now going to be one in which malevolent people will be thinking quite hard about what they can do with viruses.
Yeah, exactly. And
whether this one came from an experiment or not.
That's right, yeah. And therefore, this would be an argument in defense of gain of function research so that we have the tools to protect our population if a bad actor does this.
That's right. And most biological warfare laboratories in the West, and probably in China, are defensive. They aren't offensive. They aren't trying to build bioweapons. They're trying to work out how to detect and prevent biological warfare attacks. The person who was put in charge of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in January 2020, General Chen, she's a brilliant scientist. She's also a general in the People's Liberation Army. And she was in charge of preventing, of guarding against a bioterrorism event at the Beijing Olympics in 2012. So I think we shouldn't forget that the reason Fort Detrick in America and Porton Down in the UK and various places in China are in business is not because they want to work out how to kill the enemy, but because they're worried about what Mr. Putin or Mr. Kim or Mr. Xi might do to them.
Yeah, and I didn't list China as one of the bad actors, but they haven't been totally forthcoming. This is another theme in your book is getting accurate information has been very difficult, and so you depend on these independent scholars and researchers. And I didn't know about this group, Drastic, decentralized, radical, autonomous search team investigating COVID-19, and even your own co-author, Alina, a lot of her own research was kind of done independently to try to get at the core of some of these questions. And then the flack you get, or she got, and others, and just the hate heaped upon them online is just astounding. We just want to know what's the answer to the question.
Yeah, and the degree to which our motives are questioned. Oh, you're clearly doing this because I don't know what we are, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just think this is a really important question. How did this pandemic start? And I, am convinced that we need to find out. Alina's incredibly brave. She's a young woman at the start of a brilliant scientific career. She's extraordinarily talented. And she had a bit more spare time than usual because she couldn't go to the lab during the first lockdown. And she said, well, I'm going to try and use my skills to find out more about this virus. And one of the first things she found out was that it was exquisitely well adapted to infecting human beings right at the start. That seemed odd. SARS wasn't like that. SARS had to spend months, fumbling around trying to work out how to infect human beings. And that got her onto something. And she then noticed a bunch of papers come out in February saying it was pangolins. We found this virus in pangolins. 99% similar virus in pangolins. That was what the press conference said. Right? Okay, that's interesting. Which pangolins where? 4 papers then appeared a few weeks later to show this. They showed 95% similarity. Okay, not the same as 99%, right? Okay, that's a bit odd. And then she started going through these papers, and she said, hang on, all 4 papers are describing the same pangolins. They're not describing separate samples at all. They've given them different names, but actually when you drill down, they're the same. And not only that, they're data that's been published before. It was published in 2019. And they're from a bunch of 103 pangolins that were seized by, that were still alive when seized by customs officials in March of 2019. And of those 103 pangolins that were alive when seized, 2 had coronaviruses in them. Later, one more did. So we're talking about 3 animals here being republished 4 times in different papers. And the data was not there to back up the claims in the papers, etc. So Alina put in complaints to the scientific journals and said, hang on, what's going on here? You've allowed people to publish duplicate information in different journals while not admitting it. You've allowed people to republish stuff that was published the year before. You've allowed people to make claims without backup data. It took about a year before the journals eventually attached notes to these papers saying, yes, we admit these papers are not all they're cracked up to be, but we've allowed the authors to correct the record in various ways. I mean, the correction added to one of these papers goes on for about 10 pages. Now, that was Alina's work. Nobody else did that. That's what science should be about.
Yeah, exactly.
Challenge.
I find that astonishing. I mean, you think of these crack team of scientists at the CDC, they'd be all over this kind of stuff. And yet most of the interesting stuff comes from people online I never heard of. They're not affiliated with any university. They're just kind of working away, reading these papers carefully and coming up with stuff. And it's like, how is this happening? I thought science was this, finely tuned machine to get at the truth. And obviously there's some issues here.
Well, I've been a fan of citizen science for a long time. In this country, there's wonderful research based on amateur birdwatcher data, for example. And I think that it's very important that science doesn't become a priesthood that you're only allowed to be part of after you've, as it were, learnt the catechism. I think individuals should be allowed to contribute to this work. And the drastic people you mentioned, there's Rossana Segreto made a very important discovery very early on, which is that 2 viruses with different names published by the Wuhan Institute of Virology were actually the same virus. That was quite a useful bit of information. It could have been volunteered 2 months earlier. Now, she's a proper molecular biologist, but the connection between one of those viruses and an illness that killed 3 miners in a mine shaft in 2012 was dug out in the form of a medical thesis found by this Indian called the Seeker, who's a young man who's basically a film student, but very, very intelligent and knows how to use the internet, knows how to go into Chinese websites and find obscure bits of information. Then later on, an extraordinary Spaniard who just knows how to tabulate information in an Excel spreadsheet so he can work out which viruses were collected in which mine shaft on which date, based on data that's in genetic databases and grant applications and scientific papers, etc. And he tabulates all this stuff. He says, hang on, there's 8 other viruses very like SARS-CoV-2, which were also collected from that same mine shaft, albeit 2 years later. And 6 months later, the Wuhan Institute of Virology adds an addendum to the Nature paper saying, and by the way, we did collect 8 other viruses. Oh, thanks for telling us. Can you give us their sequences? They've given us 1. They haven't given us the other 7 yet. So these guys are the heroes of our book. And Francisco Ribera, the Spanish guy, he's a business consultant, a technology consultant. Gilles Demoneuf in New Zealand is another example. These are you need a computer and a brain to do this work. And where are the sniffing news hounds of investigative journalism in the mainstream media who ought to be doing this? Some of them have turned up, but not many. Where are the scientists? Again, some have turned up, but an awful lot have said, no, we don't need to hear about this. I approached the Royal Society and said, shouldn't you be having debates about this subject? No, we only have debates about things that are of scientific importance. What? This isn't of scientific importance? I'm sorry. It's very disillusioning for me. I'm a champion of science. I mean, I've written 9 books about science. I've championed it all my career. And I think it's just the most fantastic philosophy. I think it's the best human achievement, bar none, is the scientific method and what it produces. And yet, in this process, I've come to be very suspicious of a closed priesthood mentality in the scientific profession that is betraying the scientific method.
Yeah, and that ties to your latest book on your previous latest book on how innovation works. It very much depends on this kind of commingling of ideas and people, and nobody is smart enough to invent things out of whole cloth. We all build on each other. All ideas come from previous ideas, all
Absolutely.
of them. And yet, if you
Yeah.
have a priesthood that says, well, there's only certain ideas that we're going to allow to circulate, and then you have state actors that are autocratic in nature and they're highly secretive, like China, well, then that's going to stop the innovative process in the chain somewhere.
That's right. And, it happened. If you take a period like the Song dynasty in China 1,000 years ago, very, very innovative period. All sorts of things get invented in that time, like printing and compasses and gunpowder and all this kind of stuff. And it's a very decentralized time. It's a time when different cities basically run themselves. Merchants and others can try being entrepreneurs and innovators and inventors. And then you get the Mongol invasions. And then soon after that, you get the Ming dynasty, which says, um, the mandarins in the capital are going to tell you what you can do as a businessman. And you tell you whether you're allowed to travel, for example, how much stock you must keep in your warehouse. These are brilliant people who've been through a tremendous Confucian education system. That's what the Ming Empire is like, highly centralized. And it kills it. It destroys that civilization, basically. China becomes immensely impoverished during this time. And so uh, I just worry a little bit. This might happen to the world if we don't keep alive the spirit of democratic exchange and accountability.
Hard to know how to interpret the Chinese secrecy, whether they're really hiding something that they don't want us to know, or they're just embarrassed and they don't want the Communist Party to have this blotch on it, and it's not as bad as we think it is. I remember 60 Minutes did a piece, I think in 2020, after the WHO representatives went to Wuhan and got the tour, and then I forget who the correspondent for 60 Minutes was, but he said, "What did you see?" And then the response was exactly what they wanted us to see. we only got to see a few places in this whole institute. Like, oh, all right, well, what does that mean?
Right. No, actually, the words exchanged, I think, were, but you took their word for it. They'd said,
Yeah,
that database is of no relevance, and the reply, well, what else could we do? Well,
right.
we could try digging a bit.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, just before that, you made a point, and I was going to respond to it, but I've forgotten what it was you said.
Oh, well, the secrecy of the state, maybe,
Oh yeah,
or
yeah. Yeah. So it's true that China would probably be pretty secretive anyway. It was heavily reprimanded by the World Health Organization in 2003 for having been secretive about the SARS virus and jolly nearly resulting in a global pandemic as a result. Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Director General of the World Health Organization, was pretty strongly critical of China then. This time, uh, Dr. Tedros, elected Director General of the WHO with Chinese backing, went to Beijing and said, words fail me in my admiration for Xi Jinping's openness and transparency. Well, I mean, that's a joke. Sorry, the one thing they haven't been is open and transparent. We've had to get information out of them by the back door as and it's not been volunteered. Now, you can say, well, Chinese communist regimes bound to behave like that. Communist regimes always do. Well, for a start, that's no excuse. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be like that. Why should it? But also, I think it's worth remembering that in those early weeks, they never expected it to go global. They thought in December and January they were dealing with a little local outbreak of a new virus that they would soon get under control, as they did with SARS. Um, and therefore, they didn't need to worry terribly about how it looked to the world, what they were doing, punishing these doctors for talking about it, uh, denying human transmission weeks after it was obvious that that was happening, and so on. So I think a lot of things were done in those early days, by scientists in institutes and so on, they were worried about what the regime would think about what they were doing, rather than whether it was the right thing to do. When a professor in Shanghai got one of the first genomes of the new virus sequenced, he put it on an international genetic database, which is the right thing to do. But he embargoed it. He said nobody else can look at it for a long time. After about a week, a couple of people in the West said, well, hang on, we need to know. You've got this dangerous new disease. Can we please see the virus? And eventually his colleague who he'd worked with, Ed Holmes in Australia, put pressure on him and said, come on, let's just release it. So they released it to a blog and said, look, okay, here's the genome. We unlock it. Anyone can see it now. He was punished by the regime for doing that. Now, why was that? Was it because the regime wanted to hand the diagnostic tools industry around this virus to its chums in industry? There's some evidence for that, actually. So there's a crony capitalist explanation for what went on here, as well as a sort of more sinister one. But either way, it's not good enough. And, we shouldn't in the West sort of say, well, the Chinese will be the Chinese. The Chinese people are wonderful people. They do fantastic work. But I'm sorry, their regime can behave very badly indeed, both towards the Chinese people and towards the rest of the world. And that needs saying.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And you do in the book. Comes out quite clearly. All right, Matt, let's kind of bring this toward the end here by giving us the best arguments you have for the lab leak argument, best arguments for the spillover argument, and then give us your instinct or intuition about which one you think it's likely to turn out to be.
Okay. Well, best argument for it being a spillover in a market is that we know these viruses are in bats. We know that other animals can pick up these viruses from bats. We know this is a very infectious virus. So if anybody was, hanging around bat caves while smuggling pangolins or hog badgers or bamboo rats or anything, then they might well have picked it up. The animals might have picked it up. The people might have picked it up. They might have come to the market. A lot of the early cases were in one particular market, not the very earliest cases. We know that because the genetics show that it goes back beyond that. But some of the early cases were in a market, and it did show up in a food market pretty well, at the start. And sure, it's in a place where a lot of scientists are studying these kind of viruses, but then they would, they study it because they want to know where it's going to crop up next. So it's not suspicious to find them studying these viruses. That's the best argument for a market theory. The best argument for the lab leak is that geographically, it's pretty odd that this virus should crop up in Wuhan. Xi Zhengli herself, the head of the key laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, said that. She said, I never expected to see an outbreak like this in Wuhan. It's not where these viruses are found naturally, but it is where scientists are studying these viruses and where they bring samples from a very, very long way away. And the closest relative for a long time to this virus was one that they had brought there and was found in their freezer. And the record of experiments they were doing on these viruses include manipulating their genes, putting them into human cells, putting them into humanized mice, which would explain how a virus had got so good at infecting human beings. And the final piece of the puzzle, this virus has a thing called a furin cleavage site, which is a 12 base pair insertion into the middle of its spike gene, which has never been found in any SARS-like coronavirus before. But it is in this thing. Now, were there experiments to put furin cleavage sites into viruses? You bet there were. Were they doing it into coronaviruses? Yes, they were. Were they doing it in Wuhan? Yes, they did it with a MERS coronavirus. Were they planning to do it in a SARS-like coronavirus for the first time? Yes. They put in an application to the Pentagon in 2018, which included exactly that experiment. I didn't get funded by the Pentagon, but was it funded by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which after all provided most of the funding for this kind of work? We don't know for sure. Alina and I do not know how this pandemic started. We lay out all the evidence and we try and take the reader down every path until we show either a brick wall at the end or an intriguing hole in the ground that might have something in it. But we both started out thinking a lab leak was unlikely. We both leaned towards a lab leak as being the likely explanation today. That's where we've got to.
Yeah, that was my sense too after reading the book. Just slightly, if you had to put a Bayesian percentage on it, 51-49 or 55-45, something like that. I would say. But the only way to know for sure is more information, which means more transparency. And so we'll see.
Well, our big conclusion is we desperately should find out. The world should be. It's really important we find out so that we know how to prevent the next pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say this is the most important thing that's happened in our lifetime. You and I are close to the same age, and it's like, again, think of anything that has been so jarring, not just medically and public health wise, but economically, politically. I mean, it's just affected everything.
I think it's the keenest mystery of the 21st century, bar none.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well said. All right, Matt. Thanks for this important work. I don't know where you go next. Your book will certainly have to have an update every year for probably the next couple of years.
That's a point. Yeah, give me a break.